Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and also some new ones as well. So if you are not already on our mailing list, please send me an email after this event and I can arrange to add you. It turns out sharing something in virtual reality is exactly the same as in real life, as we appear to be missing a speaker. So if Luca Ratti is hiding somewhere under a pseudonym, could that person raise their hand? No, okay. Conferences are conferences, eh? So in that case, it looks like we have three papers for...
I'm so sorry,
Yes.
I've raised my hand through the chat. I'm not sure if you can see me. I'm actually behind computer services at EUR. I'm so sorry about it, but I'm here.
Great, brilliant. Okay, so we have all of the papers. So in that case, we'll go in the order that they are on the program, which means our first speaker will be Heljä Ossa, who is speaking about forecasting NATO's burden sharing disputes. Heljä, the floor.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jocelyn said, my name is Heljä Ossa. I'm a researcher at the Finnish National Defense University in Helsinki. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present the research that my colleague Tommi Koivola and I have conducted over NATO's burden sharing disputes. I will give a very brief overview of our monograph that we are currently finalizing, and I'd be very interested in hearing any comments or improvement suggestions that you may have. Just a second, I'll share my screen now. Jocelyn, could you please enable me to share the screen?
Dee, are you able to do that?
No, it said host disabled attendee screen sharing, but that's okay. I don't necessarily need it. Well, that's okay.
It has to be done. It has to be Dee, the one giving you the permission to share the slides. So, sorry, now Lena is the host, okay. I believe. So maybe Lena can do that for you.
I've just been made the host right now, so yeah. I will actually allow you to actually look. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, yes, I am. Perfect.
It's so nice that we have the same computer problems as in real life.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the delay.
Yeah, all right, back to business. So burden sharing, it's one of the most persisting sources for disagreement within NATO and also one of the most studied issues within the alliance. But still, we argue that not enough has been said about the various dimensions of burden sharing, and this has motivated us in our work. In our monograph, we have three basic arguments. First, we argue that burden sharing has far too often been regarded as an internal NATO issue that could be managed through rational calculus. But we claim that burden sharing should not be isolated from the overall frameworks of transatlantic relations, but in fact we should discuss the broader state of transatlantic relations when studying burden sharing. Second, we argue that burden sharing is an evolving historical phenomenon that is constantly changing. The debate may have appeared rather static during the Cold War years, but since then the burden sharing agenda has expanded and it has gained a lot of new dimensions. And in fact, we have found that the closer we come to our own time, the more challenging it becomes to isolate burden sharing questions from other issues that concern NATO and transatlantic relations in broader terms. And third, we argue that burden sharing can be better understood if it's tackled as a cyclical phenomenon that has distinct phases. The topic has gained a lot of attention recently, especially during and after the 2016 US presidential elections, but burden sharing is by no means a new phenomenon. We claim that the burden sharing disputes emerge and re-emerge on the transatlantic political agenda every now and then, and especially during transitional phases, such as organizational reforms, enlargement process, changes in military strategic thinking, out-of-area operations, and so on. The burden sharing debate is as old as the Alliance itself, as you probably know, but the debate has never been static or linear. Instead, it's periodic, even cyclical, and it only appears in NATO's political agenda every now and then. And in our research, we seek to reveal patterns of when and why burden sharing becomes a hot topic. And we look for themes of change and continuity. And this way we try to forecast what kind of themes may surface in the future burden sharing debates. But I want to point out here that we are not going to make any deterministic predictions about the future, but instead we seek to recognize certain key variables and analyze them critically. I won't go very deep into the meta-theoretical considerations here, but we can of course discuss them during the Q&A. Now it suffices to say that the previous burden sharing literature can be roughly divided into two traditions, the rationalist and post-positivist. Traditionally, the rationalist approach has been the dominant one, but especially after the end of the Cold War, the debate has gradually shifted towards more constructive approaches. If we put it very simply, the rationalist approach focuses on more measurable facts, such as allies' physical resources, material capabilities, defense budgets, and so on. Post-positivists then again look at burden sharing through the use of language, discourses, deeper undercurrents, and they consider burden sharing a social phenomenon. And it seems that the growing trend is to accept the idea that this kind of constructive analysis can complement a more traditional rationalist analysis, and it doesn't necessarily have to contradict it. And this is also our approach to the topic. So instead of analyzing burden sharing through one singular IR theory, we found it more appropriate to conduct historical analysis from a more comprehensive viewing point. So we do take into consideration rationalist aspects, such as interstate bargains or power structures, but we also consider burden sharing a historical, political, and social phenomenon. So we see burden sharing as a constantly moving process that is affected by both geopolitical but also cultural events. We have discovered 4 drivers or tracks that we follow throughout our research. And these are geopolitical changes related to Russia, US foreign policy retrenchment and renewal, European passivity and activism, and significant NATO out-of-area operations. So what we do is that we assess all these drivers in the Cold War, post-Cold War, and also in the post-2014 or post-Crimea security contexts. These drivers, they don't appear in turns or in any specific order, but they may appear in the political space simultaneously and also often cyclically. In other words, NATO often faces several different burden sharing disputes at the same time, but it's also possible that burden sharing does not appear high on the political agenda for some time. Due to the limited time that we have here, I cannot unfortunately go much deeper into the drivers at this point, but instead I will finish presenting some of our initial findings that are of course related to the drivers. First, burden sharing debate is closely linked to the Allies' different approaches to security and their threat perceptions. During the Cold War, Europe considered NATO to be there first and foremost for European security and defense, but at the same time, the US had a more global approach to security. So Europe was mainly interested in the security of its own area and its closest neighborhood, and it was reluctant to contribute to the burdens of the US elsewhere in the world, in places like Korea or Vietnam. And similar trends continued during the post-Cold War years, when Europe and the US had rather similar threat perceptions, but strategies on how to approach them were essentially different. And this became clear, especially in the out-of-area operations. So the US relied on hard power and was and still is more interested in the military spending and military capabilities when discussing burden sharing. And Europe then again is still very much a soft power actor and prefers to talk about wider issues of security, not just the military side or the financial, only the financial aspects of burden sharing. Second finding is that especially during the Cold War years, the main focus was on financial contributions and on national military budgets, which were the main burden sharing measurements. Defense spending and the GDP shares spent on defense are still under close scrutiny, especially by the US and President Donald Trump. But again, the closer we come to our own time, the more attention is also given on other factors. Nowadays, the Allies give more attention on how they contribute to common defense or crisis management operations. They pay more attention on how willing the Allies are to cooperate and fight together, who are willing to go to the most dangerous areas in places like Afghanistan, or if there are countries that often employ national caveats. And third, burden sharing as a political topic seems to be expanding. The debate is much more complex nowadays than what it was during the Cold War years. And we think there's reason to expect that the debate will expand even further in the future. And also the geographical scope of the debate is likely to expand now that countries like China pose new challenges to the international security, and that of course affects NATO and its burden sharing debate as well. Finally, we argue that burden sharing has become almost a synonym to the various issues debated in the transatlantic community, and it has become to signify many intra-alliance grievances. So this is one reason why burden sharing has become such a negative word recently, but still it's worth noting that burden sharing is not only a negative thing, it's actually one of the most significant benefits that the Allies gain as members of NATO, and this only increases the importance of the topic. Thank you very much for this brief opportunity to present the research. I'd be very glad to hear any comments or questions that you may have during the discussion.
Who is going to speak again on NATO? Luca, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello, hi again. Thank you for the organizer for having me here. Thank you everybody. And it's good to be back at BISA. I used to be a member a few years ago, but I haven't renewed my membership for a few years, but I'm very glad for the opportunity to present here. And actually, my presentation will not be focused on only on NATO, but will be focusing on European security institutions. So I will somehow, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I do apologize. You'll have to leave somehow with my face and my voice. But I don't think it will make a big difference in terms of what I'm going to say. So the presentation will focus on European security institutions, certainly NATO, and to an extent I will also try to provide a bit of a glimpse on the European security and defense policy. And what I will suggest is not so different from what somehow was put forward in the first presentation, the need for analytical eclecticism in order to capture the complexities of the current European security environment. And let me say how and why. We have seen this is a field that has been highly contested, at least since the early 1990s, when NATO was called upon to renew itself after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and when the European Union, for the first time, somehow showed an interest in developing a more robust first foreign and security policy, and from the late 1990s also security and defense policy. So for almost like 30 years, let's say 25 to 30 years, this field has been hotly contested, but from the analytical and from the historical standpoint. And what I will focus upon during the presentation is more the analytical side, but I will also pay attention to the historiographical debate to a certain extent, to at least to as much as it can be possible within 10 or 12 minutes. To summarize this debate, I think we've seen fundamentally two alternative positions contending for an explanation of the European security dynamics. On the one hand, the institutionalist arguments that have put forward the capability, emphasize the capability of NATO to renew itself, have been very optimistic about the European Union's ability to gain more and more ground in European security and defense, and somehow came forward during the 1990s with the idea of these overlapping security institutions, maybe also together with the OSCE back in those days, that would be able to guarantee a comprehensive and efficient approach to European security. Now, these approaches we will see have normally been identified in terms of IR theory with liberal or constructivist accounts of international relations, and certainly with liberal and constructivist accounts of international institutions. On the other hand, instead, the more, let's call them traditional in a sense, or state-centered and systemic approaches to international relations, which can be mainly identified certainly with the different variants of the realist analytical perspective, they tended to be more pessimistic and emphasize fundamentally the difficulty for these institutions to either renew, in the case of NATO, its role in European security, or for the European Union really to find a purpose in post-Cold War Europe after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and at least for the time being, this was the situation certainly during the 1990s and still in the early 2000s, the disappearance, or at least the return home of the former Soviet or Russian threat. Now, these different evaluations have also fundamentally revolved upon the nature of these institutions. So not only like their ability to act, but also their fundamental character and nature. And certainly they affected the evaluations that have been given of the agency of NATO and the European Union, their capabilities to adapt, their reform and innovation process, and certainly their growing relevance, as in the case of liberal and constructivist analysis, or irrelevance, as in the case of realist argument. And more recently, especially after the early 2000s, and especially after the 2008 economic crisis, I think like the term that has been crucial in this debate has been the resilience of these institutions somehow, especially from, as I said, a liberal and a constructivist argument. The realists instead have been fundamentally very skeptical. They have always traditionally questioned the idea that international institutions could possess an independent agency. If anything, certainly this agency would be very weak and certainly shaped by the interests of the more powerful member states. So the United States in the case of NATO, and probably France in the case of the European security and defense policy. Systemic dynamics, in a sense, will make it tough, according to the realist perspective, any attempt to reinvent these institutions after the end of the Cold War. And inevitably, the interests of the member states will come to clash. It will be so much more difficult to reconcile the national interests, to agree on common policy, on strategies, including burden sharing. And this is a debate that certainly, as we face now with the Trump administration, but I think the origins of the post-Cold War burden sharing debate date at least to the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the end effect of this systemic and state-centric somehow then dynamics for the realists would be the growing irrelevance of these institutions, maybe one day the collapse of the European Union or the withering away of NATO. Again, a debate that has lasted for more than 2 decades and certainly has not come to a definite conclusion. So my argument, or the argument that I would like to put forward in this paper, is fundamentally, again, the same argument that my Finnish colleague put forward in their paper about burden sharing. Nobody's right. Who was right at the end of this debate? Well, it would be very partisan in a sense and not very academic, I believe, or objective to be able to point fingers towards winners and losers of the debate. Instead, the complexity of the European security architecture can only be understood fundamentally by reconciling together the realist or wannabe objective understanding of international relations, and on the other side, the more subjective normative account that liberal and constructivist scholars have tried to put forward of both the role of international institutions, European security, and of the transforming European security environment. Certainly, we have a security context in Europe that has been shaped by both systemic and state-centered, but also by institutional and normative dynamics and variables in a sense. And my personal argument, my personal impression is that these agencies that shape European security now can both be defined in terms of being hybrid. This applies both to the states and to the institutional personalities of NATO and the European Union. Certainly, like the member states of NATO and the member states of the EU, today they are not able to exert their sovereignty maybe with the same power, with the same influence that they were able to do during the Cold War. At the same time, NATO and the EU have gained increased personality, but they've gained increased agency, but certainly it's yet not an agency that is fundamentally able to operate regardless of the priorities of the inputs that come from member states. Especially, it would be unthinkable probably to believe that NATO will be able to survive if the United States, whatever administration in the United States, decided to fundamentally reduce its commitment to the alliance or even maybe to withdraw from NATO. Equally, it would be very difficult today, or certainly not realistic, to think of a European security and defense policy that would be able to continue to play any role in European security if France decided to look in a different direction. Certainly, this is unlikely to happen. But again, it proves very much how the institutional personality or agency of these institutions would probably be not equal to zero, but certainly very weak without the participation of the most powerful member states. So this situation has certainly impacted upon the extent to which the reform and innovation process of these institutions have been successful or not successful from the late 1990s and during the 2000s. Certainly NATO, unlike the European security and defense policy, or today the common security and defense policy, can rely on an institutional history that is much more significant. Europe never built during the Cold War any equivalent in terms of a military institutional structure. When the Western European Union was dissolved, initially only its peacekeeping and crisis management functions were passed over to the European Union. And certainly, although very slowly from the early 2000s, some EU structures have been put in place, there is no yet comparison that the SDP will be able, or the Common Security and Defense Policy today, to match anyhow NATO, even to serve, in a sense, as an ancillary function, I think, to the role of the alliance. And if we see, I'll talk about it later on, about the current operation Irini in the Mediterranean, I think it becomes very clear how there is still a significant cleavage and difficulty in coordinating properly the action of these two institutions. But despite the fact that NATO has still been able to retain a significant institutional strength over the common security and defense policy, we have seen the trouble of reconciling the interest of the different member states, their own strategic priorities, and of finding a common purpose. It is a trouble that dates back maybe to the early 2000s. If we leave behind the 1990s, maybe as a successful time of NATO reinventing itself as a crisis management actor in Europe, we are seeing when the alliances look out of area, from Afghanistan to Iraq into Libya, how much the interest of the member states, despite, to understand these operations, having been at least Afghanistan and Libya, partly successful, came to clash. Of Afghanistan, initially, the United States was very reluctant to enlist the European members of the alliance. The European members participated only to ISAF from 2003 onwards, but were clearly left out from Operation Enduring Freedom, maybe with a partial exception of the United Kingdom. In Iraq, NATO risked to experience well, as Nicholas Burns, as the then US ambassador to the alliance put it, a near-death experience over the division between the United States and France and Germany on the other side, but also over the tension between old and new Europe among the older members of NATO and the then would-be future members of the alliance. And again,
Luca, you're running out of time.
Okay, I'll try to be very fast. And again, over in Libya, we had a very similar problem with the Europeans being absolutely dependent in terms of ammunition capabilities over the United States. And for example, the Eastern European members of the alliance showing very little interest. So from burden sharing to the idea of returning to Europe after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, I think transatlantic tensions have persisted, and they certainly cannot be simply ascribed to an administration in the United States or to changing governments in Europe, but they certainly reflect systemic dynamics. Those systemic dynamics are the same that continue to plague the common security and defense policy, the taking off of which has been very, very slow from the early 2000s, and certainly today it cannot be referred to as a success story. If anything, we've seen, and I'll cut this short and I'll be done if I'm allowed within a minute or two, we've seen a number of statements from key European decision makers, from Macron challenging NATO over cerebral debt, to Merkel that a few years ago after a G8 summit noted as the Europeans couldn't any longer rely on others to preserve their own security. More recently to Trump, calling again Germany as a delinquent state within NATO for, according to the US president, not meeting its financial requirements within the alliance. And more recently, Operation Irene in the Mediterranean, where the European Union has clearly been unable to stop the shipping of weapons to the warring factions in Libya. It seems to me to see a bit of a repetition of what the WU was doing in the Adriatic in the early 1990s with Operation Sharp Guard, when there was no way of preventing arms somehow being smuggled into Yugoslavia back in the day of the Yugoslav wars. And then the unclear relationship with Russia and the emerging role, still not clearly defined by NATO and EU, of China. So much tension on how these institutions and the member states would like to look at China. What is the end result? It's a mix of systemic, state-centric institutional dynamics. And it's very, very difficult, I think, to make any prediction or to come to a very conclusive remark. Certainly, both institutions are not in their best health ever, but they're certainly not dead. And tensions were already present, certainly during the Cold War times, but the new international system is much more fluid, has become much more uncertain. And to conclude, my argument is that to discard these institutions too fast and too quickly, despite their weaknesses, may open up the prospect for very unsettling scenarios for European security. And I apologize for having taken a few extra minutes, but thank you so much for your patience.
To ask a question, can you just write your name in the chat function, please? Arantxa.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all the presenters. I really enjoy all the presentations. I would like to ask a question to Paulo in particular, as in relation to the role of China in relation to Latin America. Broadly speaking, I only have read a few articles on the way China is projecting power across the entire Latin America. In relation, for example, to the way the issue of Taiwan is coming along in those discussions, in relation to the investment that China is developing, in relation to the Confucius institutes that China has helped to develop. And considering those 3 points, for example, or any other points that you might want to add to that. I was wondering if you could discuss further your point about soft power, because you mentioned the idea that China cannot compete with the US in terms of soft power, but perhaps in the case of Latin America, there is actually room for China to develop further its soft power. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Over to you, Paulo. You're still on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Aranza. Well, Latin America is not in North Atlantic, but I will be glad to answer you. Yeah, you are. That's right. Latin America is very important, and I would say that U.S. Fourth Fleet probably could have a role together with Brazil, and specifically with the importance of not just importance, but the way Bolsonaro emulates and in terms of foreign policy and copies and signs, and what the U.S. did with Israel, the capital, what the pro arms lobby, etc., etc. But I would say, if you want to turn to Latin America, leaving thus North Atlantic, I would say that there is also room for NATO to be more present there, especially considering former president of Argentina, Kirchner, when she said regarding the Falkland or Malvines that these islands strategically located in South Atlantic could be nuclear in terms of strategy, placement, etc. for NATO. Because if there is a void in North Atlantic, there is also a void in the South Atlantic. But I don't want to, I want to answer your question when you talked about soft power. Yes, China is China is a latecomer in almost everything. In oil, China was usually an oil exporter until '93. Then China moved abroad in search for oil because, and it turned to Latin America and to different countries. China is a latecomer in terms of space race. China is a latecomer in soft power. It was a book written by Joseph Nye and translated into Chinese in the 92-93 that turned China's attention to this concept. China understood that it's not enough to conquer the world by buying. You cannot win people's hearts and minds. When I travel to Central Asia, I ask, how is the BRI? How is the Belt and Road there? And it was a Kyrgyz who answered me, well, we welcome China, China's money, but not the Chinese himself. And you have this kind of complaints all over the world. Latin America, Angola, where I've been, Central Asia. In soft power, it's true. China is now trying to build its own narrative of the world, a community of common destiny, globalization, responsible stakeholder. But it's different when you have a China building artificial islands in South China Sea, and with China defending globalization, and the opposite. It's not true when US companies and European companies want to access Chinese markets. In terms of soft power, the main difference between US or European soft power and Chinese soft power is that it's some people that are free to have a dream. So the dream, the soft power in the Western world is a collection of several individual dreams. I want to have a house, you want to have a house, I want to be happy, you want to be happy. In the Chinese system, the Tianxia, the community, the individual doesn't count for anything. It's just the survival of the system. There is no soft power. There is some, actually on the opposite, there is what the state wants to be said through the Confucius Institutes, through the embassies all over the world. So there is no soft power. And people do not feel attracted by this kind of, oh, you can tell me, okay, but Chinese are very active in Latin America, not just in Latin America, and all over the world, spreading its culture, but it's fine. It's fine, you can learn Chinese, but you don't have necessarily the Chinese dream. It's a different thing. So they want to disseminate their culture, they want to disseminate their many aspects related to their food, to their ancestral past, okay? But it's different when you feel attracted to go to China, study in China. China is already a third pole when it comes to US and Europe dominated landscape for education. People go there, but when they come, well, they feel more comfortable to talk about China, but many times they don't want to return there, see? So it's a different notion of soft power. But I would say, yes, China is now working on that field as well to rebuild its notion of the Middle Kingdom, although adapted to different circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to ask questions? Please, could you just put your name in chat? But in the meantime, can I ask Heljä a question and abuse my position as chair?
Sure.
You at the end, you sort of rushed over your conclusions, and I was wondering if now we've got a bit of extra time, as I thought we had a fourth speaker. This problem of relying on an old version of the program. I wondered if you could just expand a little bit on where you think burden sharing is going in the future. Thank you.
All right, that's a very broad question. Well, as I said during the presentation, it seems that the whole topic is expanding. And this is a long trend, basically throughout the post-Cold War years. The topic has expanded, and basically the more there's new technologies, the more there are new actors in the international arena, in international relations, the more there are members in NATO, the more the whole topic expands. And of course, then burden sharing becomes more and more complex all the time, and then it may become a bit like it becomes confusing, like what is actually about burden sharing and what are the other issues that concern NATO's future. So it will probably be very difficult to understand what are the deeper undercurrents that actually are about burden sharing and what are other problems inside NATO. But summarize somehow, the future, yeah, it will be a lot more complex all the time. And yeah, that's a very difficult question, because as I said, we're not making any predictions, but we try to understand the broader picture and maybe make some forecasts, but not any deterministic predictions. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but
sorry, it was a bit of an unfair question. I will admit I publish a journal that seems to be publishing everything that's been written on Atlantic burden sharing recently, European security, and so I've kind of got this perverse fascination with where this whole debate is going. Yeah. But I shall stop abusing my position as chair, because Andrew Cotti has a question for Luca.
Hi folks. Luca, thanks for your paper, and I'm certainly sympathetic to your argument for an eclectic approach in terms of different theories. Maybe sort of two interrelated questions. One, I suppose, I mean, it's often argued that realism and liberalism have, you know, fundamentally different and incompatible bases about, you know, what they think drives international politics. So I wonder if you could say any more about sort of where you stand on that, and, you know, is it possible, as perhaps you're trying to argue, to reconcile, you know, let's say a realist approach which focuses on balance of power versus a liberal approach which might say that domestic politics matters. And then maybe the second part, which is interrelated, and I think you may perhaps even have written on this yourself before, neoclassical realism. How do you see neoclassical realism fitting into these different theories, and how does that relate to European security? Thank you.
Hi, Andrew, and thank you for your question. Well, I'm sure we have discussed it in the past, and if I had to frame what I said within one analytical perspective, probably I wouldn't choose any, because although neoclassical realism or maybe the English school, they do sit to an extent in the middle, or they do a long way to try to reconcile state-centric or systemic approaches with unit level or institutional visions of international politics or European security in this case. I'm afraid that just like trying to pick up one theoretical approach will become like probably a pointless exercise. And this is exactly what the paper tried to do. Of course, like, I think within 10 minutes, it's probably difficult to do this, but to point out that none of those approaches would alone be able to capture the complexity of the European security dynamics. And what does that imply? Certainly there are systemic pressures there. Certainly the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, they can be maybe best understood by using a traditional realist approach. I believe it is very difficult somehow to get rid of a balance of power and power politics in international relations, at least as human beings continue somehow to be dominated by the mindset that is dominating them. Yeah, since maybe Homo sapiens came to this planet. But at the same time, I do believe that institutions have acquired certainly increased relevance within European security. But as I said, those institutions, without the support of the most powerful member states, would probably be unable to exert any dramatic or significant influence on the European security network. And I think a very good example of this is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In the early 1990s, there were a lot of voices, hopes, that this would be the perfect place, maybe for the United States, Russia, the European countries getting together and sorting out, building a more comprehensive, really truly pan-European security system. And certainly we're not seeing that happening. And for the same reason, we see the common security and defense policy really struggling, I think, to take off, as much as liberals and constructivist scholars would like to tell us another story. And so in brief, maybe we could certainly argue that neoclassical realism, taking a little bit the middle ground of the English school, or even conventional constructivism, they're certainly in a good position, I think, to be able to capture best and most and widest range of these dynamics. But if I had to choose one in particular, well, I think the paper actually tried to make the opposite suggestion. Let's get rid of this obsession with what theory is right, what theory is wrong, but let's try to get the strengths from the different approaches that certainly look at different aspects or relevant, in a sense, for European security and defense policy. And however, in final, certainly I've written in the past from a realist perspective, and I believe, as I said a few minutes ago, the balance of power politics certainly remain a fundamental dynamic that cannot be ignored by any constructivist or post-structural approach to international relations.
Okay. Any further questions?
Maybe a good one for Heljä, if I may ask it.
Certainly, yes.
Heljä, in a sense, as you said, burden sharing has been a key theme of NATO's politics, maybe even from the early 1950s, yeah, when the Americans pushed for West German rearmament in Europe and so on. But during the Cold War, when there was a fundamental agreement, more or less, upon the Soviet threat, it was somehow straightforward that after a while the Allies would be able to come to an agreement about burden sharing, yeah, despite the ups and downs. But my impression is that if we forget about the early 1990s, from the early 2000s onwards, now this debate enters somehow a new dimension. And now that NATO, well, we heard about Russia, but also we heard about China. Now that NATO members somehow have more than doubled in a sense, yeah, from the early Cold War days. So we certainly have a lot of different priorities, a lot of different interests. And we have a strategic concept that has not been updated in the last 10 years. And we know why this is not being updated. How do you think that maybe lack of a clear enemy may influence burden sharing in the future? Because NATO may still talk about comprehensive security, but in Rome, comprehensive security is understood to be mainly about Libya. Maybe in Estonia or in Lithuania, comprehensive security, or in Poland, in Warsaw, it means something different.
I absolutely agree with you. It's true that during the Cold War, because when the Soviet Union was the main threat, even though the burden sharing was unfair back then, Europe did absolutely very little compared to the US. But because the Soviet threat was so severe, it was considered so severe that burden sharing, even if it was unfair, it was kind of pushed aside. It's like, okay, this is not as important as defending against the Soviet Union. But it's true nowadays, especially the Southern Europe and West are more concerned about terrorism, immigration and that kind of things. And then in the North and East and Central Europe is more concerned about Russia. And yeah, it's true that now that these two very fundamental differences kind of crash. So I absolutely think it's one reason why the security strategy has not been updated in 10 years, even though it absolutely should be updated. For example, considering the Chinese challenge. So, and yeah, it's not only about burden sharing, but also the broader state of North Atlantic and European security that's affected by this kind of very fundamental threat perception differences.
Thank you. I have got other questions that I quite like to ask people, but does nobody else want to ask a question? Or are you all just sat there on your sofas, sort of relaxed and listening in, but not participating? It's very weird talking to blank screens.
It's Friday, we have to forgive them.
Okay, so as nobody else is volunteering, I would like to ask Luca something, and that is, you said that you thought the CSDP was flourishing largely in the imaginations of those who would like to believe it was. But we have seen quite a lot of activism in the since 2016. So PESCO, European Defence Fund, military mobilities, all of that sort of stuff. Are there not signs that perhaps post-Brexit, the EU is finally getting its act together?
Yes, we have seen a bit of movement. And again, if you go throughout history, it's not the first time that we see movement when it comes to talking about European security and defense policy, or the common security and defense policy. Certainly we've seen PESCO. We've seen, for example, the European Intervention Initiative that was launched by Macron, somehow to keep closer the ties between the UK and the European Union. And I think more recently we have also seen a treaty that was hailed as a really big transformation in European security, like a few years ago, the Aachen Treaty of cooperation and integration between France and Germany, that for some was really meant to be a new kickstart, that would somehow even revive the Elysee Treaty from the early 1960s, when somehow de Gaulle dreamed, together with Adenauer, of the idea of a more independent European security compact from the United States. Well, my impression is that, yes, there is a lot of talks, some initiatives, have actually been taken, PESCO started, and the European Commission plan has somehow made initial impact on European security and defense policy, broadly speaking. But I also think that deep down, the European Union member states, and especially France in this case, would be very reluctant to consider not duplicating, but in a sense, decoupling Europe from the United States. And leaving aside maybe the Aachen Treaty, that in more than 2 years, I believe has produced absolutely nothing. My impression is that the statement by Macron that NATO is going through a cerebral death was actually meant to stimulate a little bit the debate about the alliance and make the United States aware about the current situation in European security. So, and leaving aside Germany, that I think that the appetite for European security and defense, regardless of the narrative that maybe sometimes we hear from members of even the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, there's still very, very little appetite for a more powerful European security role. And last but not least, I think that the best example of the persistent difficulties of the European Union is what is happening now in the Mediterranean with Operation Irini, the mandate of which I don't think has been sufficiently clarified, the ability of the European navies, for example, to block and inspect ships that are directed towards Libya and somehow are ending up smuggling weapons into either Haftar or into Tripoli, is somehow proving, I think, once again, that when European security and defense comes under a baptism of fire, there is still very little appetite or shared strategic vision among the European members to make this policy a significant, let's say, aspect of European security and defense, in a sense, to make it a proper central actor of the European security environment. So I would still be kind of reluctant to argue that those promises, those steps that have actually been taken in the last few years are able to bring about a significant change from the current state of European defense. And I think this is very unfortunate, so don't take me like for somebody that is happy to see European security and defense being at this state. But it is my personal belief that unless the European or some of the European Union members are willing to make more sacrifices in terms of their own national sovereignty, we will not see European security and defense being propelled by this type of projects.
Thanks, Luca. That's very interesting. I have Andrew Cotti again with a question this time for Paulo.
Thanks, Paulo. The paper was very interesting. It's slightly tangential to your paper, I suppose, but as I assume you're Portuguese, and obviously in Portugal, you might be able to answer the question, what, broadly speaking, is the kind of Portuguese perspective on China? To what extent is China an opportunity in terms of trade and investment, versus to what extent is China a threat in terms of being an economic competitor, but also maybe a political or even a security threat? And I suppose then that latter bit would link into your North Atlantic dimension and the Azores and so on. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Andrew. Very interesting question. Portuguese opinion is divided, but I would say that our government has been trying to, conciliate different interests. The one keeping in NATO, we are not leaving, of course, NATO nor European Union. At the same time, we have U.S. ambassador pressure on us, saying this is not the China you used to trade with about 500 years ago. This is a very different China. At the same time, we, like Greece, despite in different circumstances, I think we successfully dealt with the crisis, bailout, but you have Portugal as a case study nowadays for the whole European Union. And why do I say this? Because you have China Xi Jinping was here by the end of 2018, and several agreements, memoranda of understanding was signed, and Portugal is the first European country doing precisely the opposite of what the European Union used to do. That is, European Union cancelled the Galileo cooperation with China due to a serious suspicion on China appropriating of intelligence and to develop its own Baidu system. And what the Portuguese did was precisely the opposite, saying, well, let's build a Star Lab, which is a laboratory in order to produce microsatellites with China and also surveil oceans. When it's not a minor aspect, because we have one of the most important exclusive economic zones of the world, and if our candidacy toward the United Nations is approved, we'll have the double of our maritime platform. And at this precise moment, China in Portugal, having access to important fields, sensitive fields, oceans, a vast part of the Atlantic North, and using Portugal as well as Macau, Portuguese language is the 5th most spoken in the world, to access Lusophone countries in the Atlantic, but not just in the Atlantic. It's a matter of, it's a precedent in terms of security. And I'm leaving to also apart the issue of the golden visa, which is also a problem, seen as a problem for the whole European Union, despite Portugal is not the first country, nor the only country allowing Chinese and non-European citizens to lato sensu to come here and invest. But this opens again a precedent in terms of security. Also, Portugal is the first EU country to issue Portuguese public debt in renminbi, that is Chinese money. We have so you have security in terms of intelligence. You have security by allowing citizens from other countries and people from China, ordinary people that don't have enough money or 1 million or $500,000 to invest here. So there are suspicion on whether Chinese mafias can actually be here, and with a Portuguese passport, which is quite precious. You can go to almost 186 countries out of 199 countries in the world. So you are opening precedents. But I would say that it seems like a honeymoon with China. But until U.S. President Trump called Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, which is who is the Portuguese president, and Xi Jinping some days later, he did the same. And the mood of the Portuguese president is quite different. It's a very important diplomat, and he tries to be, you know, he doesn't express too much his feelings, but he wanted expressly to say to his counterpart, to his Chinese counterpart, that we are not happy with your delays by releasing masks. We are not happy. It was quite interesting to observe the difference of mood and on the way he dealt with the phone call from the U.S. president, and some days later with Xi Jinping. So for me, as an expert in Belt and Road Initiative, it's dubious in the sense it seems like a honeymoon. We are doing the opposite, or we are creating some concern within the European Union toward China, with our excessive overture toward China. But at the same time, it seems a bit weird that Portugal is perhaps changing its stance vis-a-vis China, and perhaps, in my view, due to the pandemic. So you have a balance of our divided public opinion vis-a-vis China. We still see in China an opportunity to diversify partners, but you see as well a competition between US and China in our deep water port of Sines, and Portuguese authorities clearly prefer. They've already said, so it's not a new. They say we will privilege the US because it's our traditional partner. Okay, so between two bids, we privilege our allies. Okay, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I think we seem to, has anybody got any last questions? If not, I think I'm going to say thank you to our three speakers.